I've been in love before, and I'm glad to say that my relationships didn't end up like these ones. We got a couple in a car trapped in a blizzard, a wildfire that engulfed a pair's RV, and even a lovey-dovey pair taking a tsunami head-on. I'm Timothy, and you won't believe how tragedy struck these couples. At first, the sedan looked like it had simply been left behind. Another stalled vehicle abandoned overnight in worsening winter conditions. But when one of the workers approached the driver's side window, he noticed something that didn't fit the scene. Timur Sadikov was 23 and worked construction jobs around Bishkek. Ayjan Kudayberdieva, similarly aged and 4 months pregnant, helped her aunt at a local market stall. They had been evicted from a shared rented room weeks earlier and planned to move to her parents' home in the Naren region for lower costs and support. To fund the trip, they sold most of what remained, including their phones, to cover fuel and food. The vehicle was an aging compact sedan with a worn battery system and heating that worked inconsistently. They left before a forecasted cold front, calculating an early start would get them across the pass before conditions worsened. That logic is not reckless. It's the reasoning of people with limited options making the best call available. Fuel was budgeted for normal conditions, not for what altitude does to an older engine in winter. The increased draw, mechanical strain, and miles added by a partial road closure that erased every estimate they'd worked out. By mid-afternoon of November 3rd, 2017, light snow had become wind-driven sheets crossing the road at ground level in Naren Province, Kyrgyzstan. Visibility dropped in waves. Timur slowed repeatedly on the ascent, reading the road by the silhouettes of roadside poles appearing and vanishing in the gusts. The engine labored under the grade. No villages lay ahead for many miles. Turning around on a mountain pass in a developing whiteout was not a real option. The dash cam footage recovered from the vehicle shows road markings disappearing entirely within minutes. Pole silhouettes briefly appear, then vanish. Timur slows to nearly a stop. Ayjan is visible in the passenger seat, rubbing her hands together, pressing closer to the heater vent. Wind noise overtakes the audio until it becomes increasingly wind-dominated before cutting out due to power instability and moisture buildup affecting the unit, and the recording degrades into fragments. The dashcam's power supply likely destabilizes under voltage drop and cold stress, and I didn't expect that kind of technical failure to feel as abrupt as it does when you watch it happen in real time. The engine gradually loses power with a rough idle before stalling completely without recovery. Dashboard lights dim and partially stabilize before weakening further. The vehicle drifts slightly right, barely a foot, off the compacted road surface into deeper accumulation. Forward movement ends. The engine stalls. What follows was reconstructed by investigators and plays out over several hours. Timur removes his outer jacket and lays it over Ayjan, who grows progressively still. They use paper packaging and fabric scraps as insulation. No open flame. Ayjan rests her hand over her abdomen at intervals. Timur checks outside conditions several times, each return slower. Breath condensation coats the windshield interior. Frost traces along the door seams. I keep returning to the frame of him placing his jacket over her. The final recoverable segment shows them seated together, Timur's arm around Ayjan, both largely motionless. The cabin light dims. Recording ends. No distress call was made. Both phones had been sold before the trip. A road maintenance crew discovered the vehicle the following morning during a post-storm sweep, 14 hours after the dashcam's last recording. Emergency services reached the scene within 2 hours of that crew's notification. The medical examiner determined both deaths resulted from hypothermia, core temperature loss sufficient to cause cardiovascular failure, preceded by progressive cognitive and motor impairment. Ayjan's examination confirmed the pregnancy at approximately 17 weeks. What I keep thinking is that their fuel estimate was probably correct. For a different day, a different vehicle, an unobstructed road. There was no obvious error. The cold front moved faster than forecast. The margin they'd counted on disappeared quietly, and the pass offered nothing to fill it. Now what happens when the people who always run toward the danger to help others are finally met with a wave that will not let them go? An incident on September 28, 2018, has the answer just for that. Darius Sirigar was 42 and worked as a junior logistics coordinator for a small regional shipping company. His wife, Melina, 41, volunteered full-time with a community health organization, distributing supplies and coordinating care across low-income neighborhoods. People who knew them described them the same way, consistently, steady, reliable, the kind who showed up before being asked. Colleagues said Darius knew the coastal neighborhoods better than most dispatchers. Melina had spent years building trust in communities that didn't easily extend it. It's saddening to know that their reputation was not incidental to what happened next. Earlier that afternoon, a 7.5 magnitude earthquake had shaken the region of Palu in Indonesia. When the initial tremors passed, most residents moved inland. Darius and Melina stayed. Witnesses later told recovery teams the couple had been distributing bottled water in a low-lying coastal neighborhood and remained behind to help two elderly residents, a man and a woman, both unable to move quickly, through the narrow alleyways toward higher ground. I think about the specific weight of that choice a lot. They had done this before in smaller emergencies, and it had always worked out. That history is probably why they didn't leave. The sea had already begun withdrawing. Witnesses on the flat rooftop of a two-story building roughly 80 feet away described it as an abnormal recession. The bay pulling back, exposing wet sand and stranded debris where open water had been minutes earlier. People on the roof were calling out. The alley below held standing water from earlier flooding, ankle-deep and moving. The first surge arrived as a lateral push of gray-brown water that swept vehicles across the main road within seconds. Witnesses later described it less as a single wave and more as a sudden, forceful surge that did not fully recede. Water in the alley jumped to waist height almost immediately. Witnesses on the roof reported the couple still moving, still upright. Darius with his arm under the older man's shoulder. The second surge was not clearly separated from the first in all accounts, but was described as a renewed and stronger inflow that overwhelmed remaining structures along the corridor. Witnesses described the water rising to chest height in seconds, not minutes. A section of exterior wall from an adjacent structure folded into the alley corridor. The current was no longer clear. Dark, heavy, carrying roofing fragments, timber, a tire. Witnesses reported seeing the couple reach a metal gate near the alley's end. They held the uprights. The gate was anchored to a cinder block wall. One witness said the wall held for a moment before the base gave way. The gate went with it. I've read a lot of survivor accounts from Palu. The detail that stays with me is how accounts vary, but consistently place both of them still facing toward the elderly residents when the structure failed. Recovery teams did not reach the corridor until well into the following day, after conditions allowed limited foot access through debris-choked streets. The coroner summary listed cause of death for both individuals as blunt force trauma consistent with high-velocity debris impact and drowning. Standard forensic language noted crush injuries and asphyxiation related to floodwaters and structural collapse. Their bodies were found within several feet of each other, near a collapsed perimeter wall, in the same corridor where witnesses last saw them. The two elderly residents they had been guiding were not recovered in the immediate vicinity. I don't think there's a clean lesson embedded in this one. Some people have shown up to enough emergencies that when the last one arrives, they don't register it as different from the rest. Darius and Melina Sirigar were among 4,340 confirmed dead in Palu. They were described by people who knew them as steady people who always showed up when things went wrong. On September 28, 2018, they did exactly that. and the city they spent years quietly serving was the last thing they ever tried to hold together. Are you ready for another one? This next story is about a couple who picked their campsite specifically for the view, and the thing they came to photograph is exactly what killed them. This trip to the Canadian Rockies was supposed to be another careful step forward, not the kind of night anyone would remember for the wrong reasons. Ethan and Naya had no indication it was their last night. Ethan, 28, was a freelance outdoor photographer, while Nia, 29, worked in environmental research administration for a government agency and was the logistician of the two. Permits, approach routes, contingencies. They had been working toward a high-altitude expedition. Everest had come up in journals and close conversations, discussed practically. This trip was part of that progression. It was October 14, 2016, and they had arrived later than planned. A gear stop delayed the drive. The camping area fell within a zone with general informational signage noting freeze-thaw instability on nearby cliff formations, with warnings posted at the trailhead kiosk. The area remained open. Ethan had identified the site via satellite imagery weeks earlier. It placed them roughly 240 feet from the cliff base, close enough for the wide-angle shot he had planned for first light. Photos of the intended composition were recovered on his memory card. I think the decision makes sense when you understand what they were working toward. The site was legal. The research was real. By midnight, the valley was quiet. A solo camper had settled roughly 300 feet to the northeast. A half-moon cast flat light across the upper ridge. The cliff above rose approximately 200 feet of fractured granite, its upper sections marked by horizontal stress lines, the result of weeks cycling above and below freezing. None of that was visible from approximately 240 feet below in the dark. The posted warnings had been accurate. What they could not provide was a date. At approximately 2:40 a.m., the solo camper woke to a single deep crack. Not a tree, but something structural, below the range of ordinary sound. He activated his headlamp. A helmet camera he had left on a time-lapse setting, recovered in partially corrupted and heavily overexposed segments, shows indistinct grain and shifting brightness along the upper ridgeline consistent with dust and debris movement forming within seconds. Then the face came down. A section of cliff measuring an estimated 40 feet across sheared outward and broke apart in freefall. The largest fragments were the size of compact cars. They struck the slope above the tree line first, driving secondary material outward in multiple directions. Two mature spruce trees at the cliff base were not knocked over. They were compressed. The tent was within that zone. The first phase lasted approximately 8 seconds. The solo camper did not move during the initial fall. He told investigators the sound that followed resembled continuous rolling thunder, directional, sustained, coming downhill in waves. Debris field analysis later confirmed the event unfolded in at least 3 sequential phases with brief pauses between major bursts. He activated his emergency beacon and moved to higher ground. Rangers received the signal within minutes but could not safely approach until dawn due to continued rock instability along the access route. They reached the site at approximately 6:10 a.m., roughly 3.5 hours after the event. Ethan and Nia were found beneath primary debris. Neither had exited the tent. The coroner's report noted that both individuals sustained unsurvivable crush injuries from sudden high-mass impact, thoracic compression, cranial fractures, and bilateral skeletal trauma to the lower body. Death in both cases was determined to have been instantaneous. No equipment failure was identified. The incident was logged in internal park records and received limited regional coverage. The park's internal review led to revised proximity guidelines for dispersed camping near formations rated for instability. I think those guidelines were right. They were also years overdue. However, I believe there is no clean place to put blame here. The warning existed. The site was open. A section of cliff that had been fracturing for weeks chose that temperature and that hour. They never did get to find out if they were ready. All right, so this next one hit differently when I was going through it. Because at least with a rockfall, there's no warning. It's over before you can process it. This next story is the opposite of that. Sometimes the most dangerous decision is the one that looks responsible. Harold and Diane were not reckless people, and they were not the kind to ignore an evacuation notice or assume they knew better than emergency crews. If anything, they trusted systems too much: maps, posted signs, official routes, the idea that if a road was open, it was meant to be used. Harold Chavez was 68 and had spent 31 years as a floor supervisor at a manufacturing plant outside Fresno before retiring with Diane, his wife of 42 years. They had been full-timing in their RV for 3 years. Friends described them as deliberate travelers, people who called ahead, read posted notices, and rarely made unplanned turns. Their travel logs were color-coded. When the primary evacuation route was formally closed that morning of August 19, 2015, motorists mentioned seeing the RV pulled over. Harold had likely studied the road atlas he kept in the side pocket of the driver's door. The secondary fire road running south through the canyon in the inland ranges of Northern California was marked on the laminated county map as emergency access. But the physical signage along that stretch was aged, partially faded, and inconsistent with current fire use classification standards. A sign at the entrance confirmed that designation. To someone who had spent 3 decades making procedural decisions on a factory floor, that sign likely read as permission. That's how I read it too, honestly, and I understand exactly why he turned in. What the sign did not communicate, because no sign could, was that emergency access roads in active fire terrain are designed for vehicles moving toward a fire, not families moving away from one. The road was unpaved, narrow, and running directly along the base of a ridge that was already drawing the fire's convection column southward. The Chavezes had no radio scanner, no fire agency frequency, and no way to know that the burn had crossed the ridge above them within the previous 40 minutes. A lookout named Ricardo Chavez, stationed in an elevated fire watchtower roughly 2 miles northeast, was the last person to see the RV moving under its own power. He later told investigators he watched it enter the smoke corridor from his position and immediately reached for his radio. He described the visibility inside the canyon as already below 100 feet and dropping. Flame torching was visible on the upper ridge to the north. He reported the vehicle's position and direction to dispatch and continued watching until smoke obscured his sightline entirely. I keep thinking about what it must have been like to watch that and not be able to do anything, just standing there with a radio, waiting for someone to answer. The 911 call from Harold's cell phone was logged at 11:21 a.m. The audio recovered from dispatch reconstruction records and call logs lasted approximately 4 minutes and 18 seconds before the line went silent. Harold's voice was calm for the first 90 seconds and fragmented by the 3rd minute. Coughing is audible throughout. Diane's voice appears twice. Investigators noted that smoke had begun infiltrating the cabin through the ventilation system well before the vehicle stopped moving. Exterior wildfire monitoring footage from a canyon-facing unit installed on a U.S. Forest Service fire lookout tower camera system and nearby utility monitoring infrastructure showed the fire behavior shifting rapidly as spot fires driven by wind gusts and ember transport began collapsing the available escape corridor from multiple ignition points. The RV stopped moving at an indeterminate point between 11:22 and 11:26 a.m. The engine likely stalled shortly after intake air quality degraded beyond operational thresholds. The last audible sounds on the 911 reconstruction are nonverbal, By the time the corridor was accessible, the vehicle had been reduced to a partial frame. Recovery of Harold's and Diane's remains was conducted over 2 days. What I keep landing on is that Harold and Diane did not ignore the evacuation. They followed what looked like the correct procedure, with the information they had, in the time they had to act. The road failed them. The sign failed them. And honestly, so did the system that put that sign there without any mechanism to close it when it mattered. Now, unlike the previous story, this next one had no visible danger at all, just a smell that a few people noticed, shrugged off, and went back to sleep. For nearly 4 decades, a 6-story residential apartment block in Seville's Triana district had stood like any other on its narrow street. Unremarkable, dependable, filled with ordinary routines. But that morning of November 3rd, 2014, before the city properly woke, something had already gone wrong deep inside its lower corridor. Mateo and Clara Vela were both in their mid-40s and had lived on the 3rd floor of that building for over 16 years. Mateo taught history at a local secondary school and was known among colleagues for arriving early and grading papers through lunch. Clara handled administration at a small family printing business. Their adult children, a son and a daughter, both living outside Seville, described them to investigators in nearly identical terms: inseparable, routine-driven, the kind of couple who had the same Sunday conversation every week. Neighbors knew them by Clara's coffee and Mateo's radio on every weekday morning at 6. The gas leak had been building for hours in the building's lower maintenance corridor, a corroded supply line running beneath the ground floor. At least 3 residents reported a faint sulfurous odor as early as 4 a.m. One knocked on a neighbor's door. Another cracked a window and went back to sleep. No one called the building's utility emergency line. No evacuation was ordered. I find that infuriating, not because people are careless by nature, but because no system told them clearly enough what to do. Gas accumulates in unventilated spaces the way water fills a bowl, slowly, then all at once. The building's boiler was scheduled to begin a preheating cycle at 6:10 a.m. The electrical ignition component activated on schedule. By then, the gas concentration in the lower corridor had already crossed the combustion threshold. A shopkeeper across the street had just unlocked his storefront and was stepping back inside when the explosion occurred. He told investigators the sound was not a crack or a bang, but a deep physical compression, as though the air around the building briefly collapsed inward due to the pressure wave before rebounding outward in the explosion front. Security footage from his shop captured a lateral blast from the building's midsection, debris spreading outward at street level, followed immediately by partial structural collapse on the left side. The footage shows window glass disappearing inward a half-second before the outer wall buckles and drops. Residents above described the floor tilting before they understood what was happening. One man on the 4th floor was thrown against a door frame and broke his collarbone. A woman on the 2nd floor fell through a partially collapsed ceiling section into the hallway below, sustaining fractures to both legs. The right side of the building largely held. The left did not. The difference between the right unit and the left unit on the 3rd floor was the difference between walking out and not walking out at all. The shopkeeper called emergency services at 6:13 a.m. Fire and rescue units arrived within 11 minutes. Recovery teams worked through the debris in layered sections. Mateo and Clara were found beneath approximately 4 feet of collapsed flooring and ceiling material, close together, in what remained of their bedroom. Physical evidence indicated they were in bed when the structure came down. Passive compression injuries, caused by weight rather than direct impact, indicated neither had moved after the initial collapse. The medical examiner listed cause of death for both as compressive asphyxia with blunt thoracic and cranial trauma consistent with structural collapse. No burn injuries were found on either body. Their children arrived the following day. A joint funeral was held 4 days later at a church 3 streets from the apartment. The son gave a brief statement to the local press. The daughter did not speak publicly. Neither returned to the site. The building was condemned and later demolished. What sucks about this story is it started with a smell 3 separate people noticed before dawn. And the only decision that could have changed anything was the one nobody made before 6 in the morning. On the surface, this next story looks like a hiking accident, but the more you read into it, the more you realize the mountain wasn't really the problem. Something was wrong with the air that morning of March 7th, 2013 on the high-altitude trail along the border ridge of the southern Andes. 2 members of the 7-person group had already noticed the barometer dropping faster than expected, and yet nobody said anything out loud. Rafael Ibarra and Sofia Lentz were both 38. They had met through a hiking club 11 years earlier. What the rest of the group had gathered within the first day on trail was that the two shared a long, complicated history of separations and reconciliations. The argument became visible around the 9-mile mark. Not through raised voices, but through positioning. Rafael moving 10 paces ahead, Sofia responding by choosing a different line up a boulder section. The group leader, a Chilean national certified in mountain safety, paused the party twice, trying to keep both of them engaged in navigational decisions. It didn't hold. By the upper plateau, the two had drifted roughly 400 feet from the main party, moving parallel along the slope edge rather than the marked trail, though occasional terrain folds and rock spurs briefly broke direct line of sight between them and the main group. By early afternoon, the weather shifted hard. Temperature dropped approximately 14 degrees Fahrenheit in under an hour, and wind from the northwest began pushing blowing snow horizontally across the ridge. Visibility for the main group fell below 30 feet within 20 minutes. They stopped moving and established position near a rock outcrop on the leeward side of the slope. Rafael and Sofia were somewhere above them on the open face, well out of shouting range. A retired forestry worker had been positioned on a lower ridge approximately a half-mile south with binoculars, tracking the group's progress before the storm intensified. Through intermittent breaks in snowfall, he could make out only indistinct dark silhouettes rather than clear figures near the upper slope edge. The movement wasn't coordinated. One figure appeared to pause and turn while the other continued along the exposed edge. Then the first figure dropped, not cleanly. A sideways lean the body never corrected. The second figure angled toward the first, and then both were moving downslope in a way that wasn't walking, triggered by a sudden slip on a hidden patch of wind-packed ice that caused one to lose footing and the other to reach instinctively, pulling both off balance. The slope below that edge was approximately 45 to 50 degrees in steep mixed scree and broken rock, with short sections approaching roughly 55 degrees, descending toward a secondary ridge drop. The witness described the movement as irregular, not a tumble in the way people imagine it, but a staggered, accelerating sequence of partial recoveries that never completed. They passed below his sight line within 40 seconds. Snow closed back over the area within minutes. No other members of the main group saw the fall directly. The group leader contacted rescue coordination by radio at approximately 3:40 p.m. Weather conditions prevented any response until the following morning. Search teams reached both individuals roughly 11 hours after the call, both visibly deceased. Coroner documentation noted blunt force trauma consistent with uncontrolled descent across rocky alpine terrain, skull fractures, multiple rib fractures, and spinal injuries in both, with injury patterns suggesting multiple intermediate impacts before a final drop. I think about the group leader often when I go back through this one. There was a window somewhere in that afternoon where a different decision might have changed things, and I suspect he knows that too. No major press covered the recovery. Seasonal incident volume in the southern Andes that autumn meant the report was filed quietly and without ceremony. 2 experienced people, more than a decade of difficult history, and a storm that moved faster than anyone predicted. That combination doesn't need embellishment. It explains itself.